industry totally. You wouldn't trade during a war, you'd be in a war. So they're going to lose all kinds of money. So one reason the Federalists are against the war is it's going to ruin their shipping industry. And it's going to ruin their profits. And they're going to lose a ton of money. So the merchants, Federalist merchants, knew that war would ruin what was left of their shipping industry and they would lose money. Now, they didn't want us to acquire this Florida land and this land around the Gulf or the southern Canadian land. Why didn't they want us to gain those? And they really didn't want us to get us northern Alabama either. Why the Federalists, why were they opposed to that land? Gaining that land? Who was going to, Emily, whose advantage was that going to be to have that land? Farmers. And do the Federalists and farmers see eye to eye? Not at all. So that they felt that would give too much power to farmers. They're just farmers who sell their stuff to us so we can make the big money. But if you acquire all this land, which is only going to benefit, in their mind, farmers, they're going to get too much power in this country, and we don't like the poor people, the average person, to have much say. We like the elite people to have much say. Okay? So, these Federalists, and there were some Republicans, who protested America's involvement in the war, refer to the War of 1812 as Mr. Madison's War. So anyone that referred to the War of 1812 as Mr. Madison's War, which is on your ID sheet, were people that were opposed to the war. And they wouldn't even call it the War of 1812. They simply called it Mr. Madison's War. Well, think about the Jefferson presidency and some of the things that happened. True or false, Ms. Jones? The United States was well prepared for a war at this time. You got a 50-50 chance, dear.
False.
That is false, because what did Jefferson do during his presidency? He cut funding for the military. So we're not ready for a war. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of our unpreparedness to go to war. Okay? I'll give you 3 examples of how unprepared the United States was to go to war. Guess how many ships the British Navy had? 800. How many did America have? Kristen, what's your guess?
200?
12. Good guess. 12 ships. Well, he guessed a lot less, which is good. So pitiful, we had 12. They had 800, we had 12. There's a pretty big example of not being prepared for war. They have 800 Navy ships, you have 12. 800 Navy, British ships in their Navy, compared to our 12. Okay. Now, they had thousands of troops. They'll have 10,000 in one battle, which we'll talk about. We had a total of 7,000 troops, total, at the time, that were ready to go. And many of our commanders were elderly Revolutionary War veterans. So not only did we not have a lot of soldiers available, the leaders were about at the end, if you know what I mean. So we had a very unprepared military. We had 7,000 troops compared to thousands of British troops, thousands of 10,000s. And all of our commanders were elderly Revolutionary War veterans, not the type that could probably lead successfully into battle. That was another big example of us being unprepared. The third problem we had is when you have a war effort, you've got to appoint somebody as overall commander of American forces. You can't have, 20 different people trying to plan strategy. You've got to have somebody that's responsible. Well, Madison failed to appoint an overall commander for the war effort, which left American troops poorly trained and poorly equipped. He inherited a bad military situation from Jefferson and didn't do a lot early to make it better. Okay? 12 ships to their 800. 7,000 troops to their tens of thousands of troops. And no overall commander appointed, which gives you disorganization, which results in poorly trained troops and poorly equipped troops. So we're not looking too good, even though we declared war here. Now, what do you think Parliament's philosophy? What did Parliament want out of this? Did they want the 13 states or colonies back? Did they want to secure them back for Great Britain? No, they did not. But they got tired of this pesky American too. And so their goal in the War of 1812 was to crush the Americans, to guarantee that the United States of America would never again declare war on them. They were going to teach them a lesson. They weren't interested in securing the colonies back or any of this land back. They simply wanted to ensure that the United States never again would have the gall to declare war on their country. So if the Americans lose the War of 1812, the United States is going to be back at the mercy of the British. Even though they're not interested in ruling us, we're not going to be able to do anything worldwide without their permission. That's their thought process. So were they interested in securing the colonies back? No. They were going to make damn sure that the United States of America never ever had the gall again to declare war on their country, and that we would be at the mercy of Great Britain on any decisions worldwide. Does that make sense? That was their whole goal behind it. They were going to give us a lesson. Now that'll take us to our next subtopic, which is interesting: early disasters at the nation's capital. Now where is the capital now, by the way? Washington, D.C., so keep that in mind. So early disasters at the nation's capital. How many soldiers do we have in our army? Okay. Well, in August of 1814, just 6 miles from Washington, D.C., 30,000 British redcoats engaged American soldiers and militia. 30,000 in one shot. So in August of 1814, just 6 miles from our nation's capital in Washington, D.C., approximately 30,000 British redcoats engaged American military forces and militia. We didn't have enough soldiers, so what did we still use? State militia. Well, how do you think, if you were living in Washington, D.C., what do you think your thought process would be at this point? Oh. So what did people start to do when these British soldiers were marching toward basically an unguarded capital? What did they evacuated? They left. People began to evacuate the city because they knew what was coming. So the British soldiers, as they marched toward an unguarded capital, residents of Washington began to evacuate the city, picked up and left. Because the American military and militia were overrun pretty quickly by those 30,000 soldiers. And these British soldiers just pour into Washington, D.C., and they destroy several buildings in D.C. in August of 1814. So the military and militia are soon overrun by the British soldiers. People are pouring, evacuating out of the city, and British soldiers pour into Washington, D.C. and start destroying several public buildings. This was an act of terrorism that you could maybe compare to the events of 9/11 when you think about it. Because we had a foreign country coming in and destroying public buildings in the nation's capital. That's what happened on 9/11. You had terrorists destroying buildings in New York City, the Pentagon, the whole 9 yards. Okay? So you might be able to compare it as an act of terrorism against the United States comparable to 9/11. Well, there were two important buildings, the Capitol building and the Treasury building, and they were still being built. They weren't done yet. They were unfinished. Well, both the unfinished Capitol building and the unfinished Treasury building were set on fire by the British. Set them on fire. And this will all tie into our trip next year, because you'll see in the Capitol the burn marks on the Capitol walls. So the unfinished Capitol building and the Treasury building were set on fire. Guess what else was started on fire? The Library of Congress. Guess what they used to fuel the fire? All the books. That's why the Library of Congress was replenished with whose personal library? Thomas Jefferson's. Because of this. They took the books out of the Library of Congress and used it to fuel the fire to burn that building as well. This is the British redcoats storming our nation's capital, unguarded. Terrorism. Burning up our unfinished Capitol, burning up our Treasury, unfinished Treasury. Going into the Library of Congress and using those books to set the fire. They even invaded the White House. Now picture this in your mind. First Lady Dolly Madison had prepared a tremendous feast for 40 people, already laid out, ready to go. Well, when they heard about the British coming to an unguarded capital, those people evacuated. But all of the food and stuff for 40 people was sitting nicely at the White House. The British soldiers invaded the White House, took control of the White House, sat down and enjoyed that meal for 40 people that was set up by First Lady Dolly Madison. They came in and just fed on the meal. After they got done feeding themselves, they ransacked the White House and set it on fire. So they actually invaded the White House, ate the meal that Dolly Madison had prepared for 40 of her guests, ransacked the White House when they were finished, and set it on fire. By the end of that siege of the White House, the only thing you could see was the shell of the White House. That was it. Everything else was burned up. You could just see the shell of the White House. And they went to several other significant federal buildings and reduced them to smoking rubble. And so this was an incredible assault on the nation's capital in August of 1814. So in and around Washington, D.C., many significant federal buildings were reduced to smoking rubble. So they just came in and kicked our rear in D.C. Well, that'll take us to our next subtopic, which is a really good one. And that was the British assault on Baltimore. Baltimore, what? Maryland, okay? So the British assault on Baltimore. Well, here's what happens. The people of Baltimore, which is not far from Washington, D.C., are looking in horror as the nation's capital is burnt and ransacked. And they know that as soon as they get done there, they're coming to Baltimore. That's going to be the next target of assault by the British during the War of 1812. They're going to come from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore. And the British plan, frankly, was to take Washington, D.C. like they did, then take Baltimore, then go to Philadelphia, then go to New York City, and do the same thing and put the American government in total chaos. Are they trying to reclaim any land or any state? No, they're just making a mess. They're teaching us a lesson. And they're going from D.C. to Baltimore to Philadelphia to New York City, and they're going to put our government in chaos. That's their plan. Well, civilians in Baltimore prepared for this invasion. They did not flee or evacuate. This is what they did. So this is what civilians in Baltimore did to prepare for this British invasion they know is coming. First thing they do is they dig defensive trenches on the town's perimeter. Okay? So here's the town, all the houses and whatever, this is the town, and they dig trenches all the way around the city of Baltimore to make it more difficult for the British soldiers to get there. Okay? So civilians dig defensive trenches on the town's perimeter. Well, what about the ports? Is Baltimore a port city? No question. So they began to barricade access to all ports around the city. So they started to barricade the ports so ships could not get in. Started to barricade ports. And then approximately 700 soldiers were placed on the outskirts of town to defend against these British soldiers. Probably about 30,000. 700. So, boy oh boy, right? Well, there was an American garrison in Baltimore Harbor. What's a garrison? No? What's a garrison? Yep, it's like a fort, a garrison. There's a fort there full of American soldiers that is going to protect the city from someone coming in by sea. And that garrison was called Fort Mchenry. And in order for the British to be successful in capturing the city of Baltimore, they would have to secure and take over that protective garrison in Baltimore Harbor. In other words, they were going to have to secure Fort McHenry. So, civilians dig trenches, defensive trenches on the town's perimeter. They begin to barricade access to all ports around the city. They station 700 soldiers on the outskirts of town, and they have to be able to defend Fort McHenry. Because of Fort McHenry, a garrison or fort in the middle of Baltimore Harbor, falls to the British Navy. The city of Baltimore is lost, and they're moving on to where? Philadelphia. Okay? Well, that'll take us to our next little subtopic, which is events at Fort McHenry. Events at Fort McHenry and British retreat. What does that tell you? They're not very successful. So events at Fort McHenry and British retreat. Okay, and I'm just going to give you a couple of facts and then we're going to quit. Now, the commander at Fort McHenry is Major John Armistead. Major John Armistead is the commander of Fort McHenry. It's his job to make sure the British do not take control of his garrison. So Major John Armistead is the commander at Fort Henry. Well, he was a little bit of a smartass. Because what he did is he ordered a new American flag to be flown over the garrison in Baltimore Harbor, anticipating the British coming. Okay? So he orders a new flag, American flag, for the garrison in Baltimore Harbor for Fort McHenry. And he wants it as large as possible. Because he knew the British would be attacking the fort soon. And that large flag was intended to be an act of defiance. You want to take Fort McHenry? Look at how proud we are. We will not let it fall. Take a look at this ginormous flag flying over the top. So he was an interesting guy, kind of a smart aleck, Major John Armistead. He was the commander at Fort McHenry, and he ordered a new American flag to be sewn as big as possible to fly over Fort McHenry, because he knew the British would be attacking the fort, and he wanted to show them just what they were in for. It was an act of defiance. Well, on September 12th of 1814, British ships of war approach the ports of Baltimore with Fort McHenry their target. On September 12, 1814, British ships of war approach the ports of Baltimore with Fort McHenry in their sights. That's their target. So here they come from England. 4 British ships of war. Now, they sent a total of 8 ships, and they're all considered bombing vessels. Excuse me, I said that wrong. They had 8 total bombing vessels in their arsenal, and they sent 5 of their 8 to Baltimore. So on September 12th of 1814, British ships of war approached the ports of Baltimore. They've got Fort McHenry in their sights. And they send 5 bombing vessels. These are the big-time ships. They only had 8 total in their arsenal. How many ships they got in their arsenal? 800. Well, they've got 8 bombing vessels that are high-powered bombing vessels. They sent 5 of their 8 to Fort McHenry. That's how serious they were at taking the city of Baltimore. Now, on one of those bombing ships was an American lawyer. You know what his name was? Francis Scott Key. And this American lawyer, Francis Scott Key, was on one of these 5 bombing vessels. What in the world would he be doing on that ship? Well, what is he? He's a lawyer. And he was actually traveling with the British fleet because he was going to negotiate the release of one of his clients that was being held on another ship in the fleet. So he had a client that he was defending, that was on another ship of the 5. And he traveled on that ship because he was trying to get his client what? Free. Well, the commander of the British fleet is a guy by the name of Robert Ross. He's the commander of the British fleet. And he goes to Robert Ross and he convinces Ross that his client is innocent. And when Francis Scott Key convinces the British commander Robert Ross that his client is innocent, Ross agrees to release him. He's going to release them both when though? After Baltimore is secured. So Francis Scott Key and his innocent client are going to have to stay on those British bombing vessels until Baltimore is taken. Once Baltimore was taken, then Commander Ross was going to let Key and his client off. Okay? Now, tomorrow I will tell you what the British strategy at Baltimore was, what happened, and what happened to Francis Scott Key and his client that are Americans kind of held hostage on these British bombing vessels until they're done. Okay? That makes sense? All right. And you're going to find out what the Star Spangled Banner is all about. Then you know the history of it, do you? Emily, I'm going to throw that pole against the wall as hard as I can in just a second.
She's not sorry.